Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful planet of ours. Welcome to Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society, and I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining today's conversation. We're going to be talking about the Endangered Species Act, which was passed in 1973 and signed into law by Republican Richard Nixon. The Endangered Species Act has served as a bulwark against unrestrained deforestation and development for more than 50 years. It's protected and helped restore the peregrine falcon, the alewife, that's an Atlantic herring species, the sea otter, and the grizzly bear, to name just a few of the species that teetered on the brink of extinction but returned to viable populations under the ESA's protection. Our guest today, Lowell Baier, was a young lawyer in Washington, D.C. when the law was passed, and he's worked at the cutting edge of environmental law for more than 60 years, including leading the development of the first President Bush's conservation policies in 1989. In recent years, Lowell has authored a comprehensive history of the ESA in 2 volumes called the Codex of the Endangered Species Act, and in his just-released book, Earth's Emergency Room, Saving Species as the Planet and Politics Get Hotter, he discusses the critical role the Endangered Species Act will play in the United States' response to climate change. You can find Lowell's books on Amazon and the Powell Books website. Now, let's get to the conversation after a quick commercial break. Welcome to the show, Lowell. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Mitch. Yourself?
Fantastic. It's a lovely
and
day.
Hello to all of your listeners out there in sunny California.
Well, we're not in California, but I'm sure the Californians appreciate that. So I wanted to the Codex of the Endangered Species Act, which I read last year, and then Earth's Emergency Room, really interesting explanations about how you've wrestled with the conflict between development and preservation in your work for many years. And I wanted to know, first off, what do you think the world would be like if the Endangered Species Act had not passed in 1973?
There would be over 1,700 species that have either been saved and taken off the endangered list or that are still on the endangered list, about 1,660 or 70. It floats back and forth month to month. Mm-hmm. But many of those species would not be with us today but for the protections of the Endangered Species Act. And the recovery that they have experienced under that act has been really phenomenal, which would not have been available to them but for the act itself. And
how do you think our lives would be different as a result of that? Because we talked about the impact on the wildlife, but how would human life be different with the loss of all of that?
It would probably not be noticeably different today. However, going forward, it certainly would be drastically changed. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Picture, if you would, a great big green balloon, and within that balloon are all of the living organisms of the earth. Everything from microorganisms all the way up to bears, whales, birds, fishes, all the aquatic species. Picture them all in a great big green balloon. Each time one of them goes extinct, a little air goes out of that balloon.
Mm-hmm.
They're gone forever. And the next species goes extinct. A little more air goes out of that balloon. And they're not replacing themselves. They are gone forever. And once that balloon gets down to where there are fewer and fewer species, it collapses and it's over, because it's a web of life where those species depend upon each other for survival. Man is at the apex of all of those creatures within that balloon, and man's future is substantially diminished because we've lost all of those species. We depend upon all of those species for our food, for our shelter, for our clothing, for our medicines. And picture, if you will, the empty the empty shelves in the grocery store back when we had supply chain issues, especially during COVID.
Yeah.
That's what the future looks like if we don't pay attention. And that's how man will be affected.
Now, one of the most interesting things about the ESA to me is the fact that it was a bipartisan law, and there was a clear shared commitment to conservation 50 years ago when it was passed. What do you think has happened to the consensus, the political consensus, that nature deserved an honored place in American life?
Two things: partisanship, the great partisanship divide that divides America, and the focus of the members of Congress on raising money and getting reelected. Mm-hmm. It used to be, back in the days when it was enacted, I should tell you that I had a bird's eye view of how Congress worked when I was 16 years old, because I was a page boy here in the House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. And I still live in Washington. My whole career has been here. Now, back then, the focus was on the national interest. And when a representative or a senator came to Washington, they were given 2 airplane tickets, one to come here and one to go home.
Yeah.
And they worked 5 days a week. Today, they get 52 tickets, round trip tickets, to go and come, and they only work 4 days a week. And the focus is on re-election and raising money, and not on the national interest. So how has it changed? The focus, the concerns of the representatives in Congress no longer are solely on the national interest. Their focus is split in many different ways, but it's primarily the survival of their office and their position in Congress.
So, I've been reading research on the idea of a governance trap in which neither the voter nor the elected politician really wants to lead. They're both waiting for the other one to tell them what to do. It sounds like that 52 times back home every year keeps the legislators too focused on their local concerns and not broadly thinking about the national interest like you're talking about.
One wonders what they're thinking about when they're back home. I know they're focused on raising money. That I know. But God knows what when I spent a year up in the House of Representatives, I was the shadow, the page boy shadow behind the majority leader of the House of Representatives, very, very senior congressman. Mm-hmm. And I really saw how Congress interacted with each other, Republicans and Democrats. There wasn't red or blue. Mm-hmm. There was the national interest and national focus. And it was not on berating each other. It was on solving the nation's problems. Without that, we as a nation have lost a lot of our guidance, if you will, our guidance system. Back when the act was passed, Mitch, it was a bipartisan effort. It was unanimous in the Senate, and all but 4 congressmen voted for it in the House of Representatives. It was basically a unanimous approval. And they embraced it. They worked together to make it the best law that they could, knowing what they knew then. And it's just not that way today. If you tried to pass an Endangered Species Act law today, you couldn't do it. The makeup is and focus of the Congress is such that you really couldn't do it.
Do you think that's a function of the role of money in politics, and particularly since Citizens United, the role of corporate money in politics, which has polarized not the politicians themselves, but the entire dialogue?
Absolutely. You hit it right on the head.
Short of revoking or reversing the Citizens United ruling, is there anything you can think of that we can do to change our relationship with the politician in DC to get them focused back on the national interest?
There is only one way that I know of. You either have a national disaster that threatens the comforts that we enjoy as free citizens in this country, that gets everybody focused. If you remember after 9/11, how this country and its people seemed to have changed for 3 or 4 days. Everybody was nice to each other. People talked. Mm-hmm. And we focused on the tragedy that had happened up in New York. But that only lasted 3 or 4 or 5 days. That's what I'm talking about. A major disaster. Let me reflect on the way it was back in 1973. It was in the middle and in the latter part of what we called the Green Revolution in the 60s and 70s. For about 20 years, the American public was very, very concerned about its clean air, its clean water, and its animals, obviously. They collectively, as a nation, got their representatives in Congress to focus on this with them. But the focus, the great power, was our American public speaking out, focused and talking. It was a relevant matter to our public in the 60s and 70s. And that's why they passed, over that 20-year period, 67 environmental and consumer protection laws. It was about 60% environmental and about 40% consumer protection. And that was all because the American people did not have apathy that they do today. They took stock of their country's environment and their safety concerns over cars and baby carriages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they got the Congress focused, and the Congress then responded. That's how it brought about not only the Endangered Species Act, which was the crown jewel of all of those laws. That's how they got the Congress focused. It came out of the will, focus, and the participation of the American public. Today, the American public has so many pressures on them, but just between media, keeping a job, children's education and their health, aging parents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's not the quiet lifestyle that we had back then. Our future is to do away with the apathy that we are suffering with and go to action.
When you talk about a crisis, because I agree with you that we need something to galvanize our attention, do you think that the climate crisis is sufficiently focused for people that they would be able to respond to, say, a regional disaster like the wildfires in the West?
Yes.
As a national crisis, or going back to that kind of, everything is a focus on local that is vaguely reflected in a putative national interest in DC. How bad does it have to get in order for people to react, do you think?
I think it has to hit them in the belly, from their foods and medicines to their income. The environmental crisis that we have been suffering with became what was called a biodiversity crisis, started maybe 20 years ago. That word came out of a conference out in California. And the focus became more not on a specific species or the pollution of a particular creek in your community, but a much broader view of our universe. And I've watched people try to understand the magnitude of the biodiversity crisis, and climate change has exacerbated that substantially. And that has been, I don't want to say it's been lost on the public, but it's so confusing and so fractured in the way it's affected the environment that few people really have come to grips with it because they're so distracted with just life in general. Let me give you a couple of examples. We have lost between 45 and 50% of our bees, our pollinators. We've lost 40 to 45 to 50% of our captive bees that you see in the white hives that are moved around the country to pollinate farms and orchards, that sort of thing. We've lost them. They're gone forever. We've lost 9 billion birds in the last 25 years. That's 25% of our bird population. And the butterflies, look at the monarch butterfly. It's lost over 90%. Both the eastern and the western monarch populations are down well over 90%. Those are our pollinators. That's what pollinates our food and provides our medicines, because pollination is part of that. Over 50% of our medicines come from nature, from plants and animals. And until the impact of those is felt at the personal level, people, I don't think, will really begin to pay attention. I think it takes that magnitude of extinction as we lose more and more. Again, that big green balloon example that I said at the beginning of your program.
Well, it's so troubling that we have to wait to see that for action. And there's another dimension of this that I want to come back after a quick commercial break and talk about, and that's the role of enforcement and particularly the Supreme Court recently. But we'll be right back. Now let's return to our conversation with Lowell Baier. He's the author of Earth's Emergency Room, Saving Species as the Planet and Politics Get Hotter. Lowell, the first part of our conversation really underscores how difficult it is to convey the criticality of our situation, that we're really on a brink that many of us can't see. And one of the things that has changed very, very distinctly over the course of the past 2 decades, since money became such a powerful force in politics, is the role of the Supreme Court. And in 2022, in West Virginia versus EPA, the Supreme Court ruled that the EPA did not have the power to implement policy that had not been explicitly legislated by Congress. I wonder if you see a viable path forward for an agency like the EPA to move the country in the right direction without getting caught up in the politics of the details of legislation.
That particular case was what we lawyers call the major questions doctrine, the major question doctrine. And when the Congress enacts a law that gives authority to a particular agency, like EPA, or they have got to be very clear in the authority that they are giving to a particular agency, and it's got to be delineated very clearly. That case involved the whole issue of how clear EPA's authority was in drafting a particular piece of regulation that may or may not have fallen within the scope of authority that was granted to them by Congress when they were first created in 1970. And this begins to get into a case that's, I'm sorry to say, is coming up, called the Chevron deference issue. Yep. Because under the Chevron case, the court said that when Congress creates an agency and passes a law, we have to rely on their judgment in taking actions in carrying out their mission as a particular department or agency. And we need to rely on their expertise in that given area. But it's got to be very clear. The direction to an agency has got to be extremely, extremely clear. And we defer then to the agency. That's why it's called the deference concept. That issue is coming up before the Supreme Court within the next couple of weeks. And I'm very fearful that authority and the scope of power that agencies might have could be dumbed down, lessened, and the like, and the courts no longer rely on their expertise at all. And gives the courts an opportunity to then second guess them and feed the litigation cesspool that we deal with in this country. Everything is litigation, litigation, litigation. Yeah. And this is just another opportunity that the courts are going to create if, in fact, they change that Chevron deference authority. So I've gotten a little off the track but it goes right to the heart of the Congress being careful in drafting their legislation and being very clear and sufficiently clear in what authority they hand to a particular agency.
In the book, in Earth's Emergency Room, you mentioned that one of the sources of resistance to the Endangered Species Act comes from its perceived rigidity, and that it's kind of a command and control approach where yes. The EPA is seen as acting arbitrarily. What changes would you recommend to the law in order to mitigate these perceptions and enhance its flexibility and to get it more widely accepted, or do we need a new law?
No, you absolutely do not need a new law. Since in the last 25 years, there have been 605 bills in Congress to either repeal or dumb down and weaken that law. The American public has paid attention and has said, no changes, leave it as it is. the vast American public may not fully understand it, but they certainly support it.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't need a new law, and we do not need to change it. Now, Mitch, to broaden this, let me give your listeners a perspective here. The men that created this law were all former two veterans, hardened veterans. Many
Mm-hmm.
of them had seen combat, and they understood from their military discipline command and control. That's how Washington thought.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look, then Truman was followed in the White House by General Eisenhower, who was there for 8 years. He was a command and control president as he was a general. They therefore passed a very rigid law, command and control. And back then, people believed in the sanctity of government, the sanctity of our banks, the sanctity of our big business. Those have all come into question. They no longer have that public perception of authority to carry out what they carry out, whether it's government or production, money lending, and so forth. What happened was when President Clinton was in office in the early 90s, his Secretary of Interior, Bruce Babbitt, who was an experienced conservationist, had been governor of Arizona and was then a senator. And Bruce realized that the Endangered Species Act was too rigid, it wasn't working, and it was just haunted by litigation and controversy. So the paradigm shift occurred under his watch when he began through the regulatory approach, not going back to Congress for changes in legislation, but through regulations that the Department of Interior created to make the law manageable and more acceptable and workable with industry, with working landowners. And there's a whole series of policies and regulations that he and his group came up with that made the law more of a collaborative law with the American public, and especially with the working landowner. And that has continued to this day. The current administration is really working hard to continue that theme, as earlier administrations have as well.
Well,
but that's where the paradigm shift started in the early 90s and has continued through to this day. And that's you just, nobody trusts Congress. You can't get anything through Congress.
So digging in on that a little bit, that dialogue based, the engagement that you're talking about, approach to the ESA that was introduced in the Clinton era, has that allowed us to continue to be effective, or is that dialogue being lost just as the dialogue in Congress was lost earlier?
Oh, no, it's continued and improved substantially, and has really helped the act become more and more effective and more applicable collaboratively with the approval of the working landowners. And I'm talking about the farmers, the ranchers, extraction industries like forestry, oil and gas, et cetera, et cetera. They've all come to terms with recognizing that, the law is not going away, and they have to learn to live with it. But there's a dialogue now. When a new regulation is passed, there is substantial dialogue before it becomes hardened into a final, what we call a final rule. And that's continuing. And there's, Mitch, there's a group that's been formed about 3 years ago called Conservation Without Conflict. And it's regular 501c3 group who is working hard across the nation to educate people in what it means by collaborative and constructive dialogue, and how you work together to get things done rather than tee off and fight against each other. And the working landowners are beginning to realize that working with the government rather than against the government and in court gets them far further along in their work and in their production.
So that's really encouraging. And in Earth's Emergency Room, you call for this recapturing a moral authority from the past. So what specific actions can we take now to amplify the benefits of the dialogue that you're describing going on? What can we change for the better?
Well, the first thing we have to do is get the public to pay attention and get the public focused and not be apathetic. I've been thinking all morning, and I've heard it so many times, what is the opposite of apathy? And I can't remember what it is, but the point is, we've got to get the public, their families, and the kids educated in the biodiversity crisis that we are facing as a world and as a planet, not just in the US. That's number one. But number two, we've got to get more funding into the Endangered Species Act. 6 years ago in Congress was introduced a law called Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And it has been reintroduced every Congress, and the government cannot seem, because of partisanship, to pass that and give the proper amount of money required to the states and to the federal government to recover more species and provide better administration of the ESA to protect our species at risk. In the House, Bruce Westerman from Arkansas introduced a bill that got passed actually this week, just in the House. It's dead on arrival in the Senate. But it was a takeoff of the RAWA, Recovering America's Wildlife Act. But it did not nearly come up to the standards that was put down in the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And that particular bill was drafted by men and women across the spectrum who work together, conservationists, working landowners, and so forth. And it really had teeth. And it provided that $1.3 billion a year distributed to the states to deal with species in crisis. And because the Congress cannot figure out what pays for that, how they offset it, and provide the funding rather than going to the general treasury. For that reason, it is not passed. And Westerman's bill, it was dumbed down from like $3 billion to like $300 million. It was a drop in the bucket compared to what really needs to be done. So that's the second thing, is getting the public to recognize what's going on, providing proper funding for the states to do work with the federal government to recover species at risk.
Well, so let me challenge you as we reach the end of this conversation to share the message that you want people to take away from Earth's emergency room and how they can apply it. What can our listeners do right now in their own lives or in their local community to enact the change that you're describing?
Talk about it. Talk about our birds and our bees and our butterflies and how critical our medicines are that come from nature, and what's going to happen if we through the loss of pollinators, that available supply of medicines grows thinner and thinner. And recognize the downside of the biodiversity crisis as we lose species. What does that mean? How does that translate to mom and dad and the kids? And it goes right to the dinner table, and it goes right to their pocketbooks through their jobs. And so they've got to talk about this with each other, with the family, with all their friends and colleagues about how real is this. I mean, read, for example, this month's great National Geographic article on the octopuses and the role that they play in the sea. It's fascinating. I mean, nature is unbelievable. I've been in love with nature ever since I'm a kid, and a fond observer of nature. And I wish the public would just begin to at least pay attention to the lack of butterflies. When's the last time you or they have seen a monarch butterfly, for example, or a Baltimore oriole here in the East Coast? The fireflies. Where are all the fireflies? That's just an indication of what we are losing as part of our work. So that's the first thing. First thing is focus on nature and what we're losing as it dies off and goes extinct. And talk to your friends about it, but pay attention, really pay attention. And then collectively, eventually, there will be enough concern in the public's eyes, they will begin to perhaps coalesce like they did back in the 60s and 70s and say to Congress, by golly, fix this, fix the problem, starting with funding. That's probably the best thing that they could do. And then push Congress, if they can get the ear of a congressman or a senator, to pass the Recovering America's Wildlife Act that puts money in the state's pockets to deal with species in crisis. Those are the two things. Very simple.
Lowell, it is very simple and unfortunately a huge challenge, but hopefully this conversation will help get that wider discussion going. I want to thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Well, it was a pleasure, Mitch, and thank you for inviting me to be on your show.
That was my conversation with Lowell Baier, and he's the author of the 2-volume Codex of the Endangered Species Act, as well as his new book, Earth's Emergency Room, Saving Species as the Planet and Politics Get Hotter. We'll share links to find his books online in the article that accompanies this podcast, so check it out. These books are definitely worth your time. There are so many directions to explore in that discussion, but I want to start with the question Lowell asked, which is, what is the opposite of apathy? And the answer is hope. Let me tell you why. I had the extraordinary opportunity to talk with ethologist and environmentalist Jane Goodall recently about her latest book, The Book of Hope. For Dr. Goodall, hope is not sitting back waiting for others to take action, but an active pursuit of the changes we want to see enacted in the world. Lowell notes that we no longer see monarch butterflies, which were common in my backyard in the Pacific Northwest 60 years ago, or fireflies that filled the evening at my grandmother's home in southern Indiana. They're almost gone, and with them, billions of pollinators that support our food systems. We cannot wait for others to act. And the first step toward action is to get out in nature. Take your family into the woods to see the beauty. Help your employees connect with nature, maybe by offering national park passes as a perk, or at least state park passes. Get people out there to see what we're losing, and then take action. Ask your congressional representatives to vote for a vital and renewed version of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act to provide the funding to support species in crisis. Find out more about Conservation Without Conflict, the 501c3 nonprofit that Lowell mentioned. We'll include a link to that in the article as well. And talk with the people who grow your food. Go to the farmers markets and get into a discussion about whether or not they have enough bees, whether or not there is a crisis in water availability or whatever. Find out about where your food comes from, how it's grown, and what we can do to make that both a more resilient and profitable experience for the people who do this vital work for us. And as Jane Goodall urges, make the world anew with the power of your choices. So I hope you'll take a moment to share this podcast or any of the more than 460 interviews that we've produced on sustainability in your ear by writing a review on your favorite podcast platform. It'll help your neighbors find us. Folks, you're the amplifiers that can spread more ideas to create less waste. So please tell your friends, family, and coworkers that they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or whomever else they prefer as a source of podcasts. I really thank you for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.